History remembers the Medici as the patrons of art, but in reality they were the original godfathers of organized crime. They didn't just buy paintings, they weaponized sex, dabbled in forbidden magic, and sold tickets to heaven to fund their own debauchery. Forget the marble statues. This is the dirty, bloody, and uncensored history of the rulers of Renaissance Italy. Cosimo de' Medici was first and foremost a banker, and in the 15th century, banking was far from a respectable profession. It was considered a mortal sin. It was usury, making money from money, which was seen as breeding something unnatural, a violation of God's law. Cosimo was the richest man in Christendom, a man who could buy popes and kings, yet he lived in a perpetual gnawing fear for his immortal soul. He knew that all the gold in his vaults could not buy his way out of hell. He needed something else. He needed a loophole in the fabric of spiritual reality. And so, while the public saw a pious man building the convent of San Marco, the private Cosimo was funding a global manhunt. He wasn't just sending agents to the east to buy silk and spices. He was sending them to scour the dustiest, most forgotten monasteries of Greece and Macedonia. Their orders were specific. They scoured the monasteries for something forbidden, the Prisca Theologia, ancient wisdom that predated Christ and whispered of magic, distinct from the logical works of Aristotle taught in the universities. The wisdom that predated Christ, the magic of the ancients. The seeds of this obsession were sown in 1439 at a pivotal moment, the Council of Florence. This was a massive diplomatic event intended to heal the rift between the Catholic Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of the East. The streets of Florence were filled with bearded scholars and mystics from Byzantium, men who carried with them the dying embers of the Greek world. Among them was a man named Gemistus Pletho. He was 80 years old, a charismatic philosopher who spoke of Plato not as a logician, but as a mystic. He whispered to Cosimo and his circle about a wisdom that had been lost, a wisdom that claimed man was not a sinful wretch begging for mercy, but a divine being capable of manipulating the stars and the elements. He spoke of high magic, a spiritual science distinct from the cheap tricks of street conjurers, capable of elevating a man to the status of a god. For Cosimo, a man burdened by the guilt of his wealth, this was intoxicating. It was the answer he had been praying for. If he could master this ancient wisdom, he would transform from a sinner into a magus. He was no longer breaking God's law, but decoding the deeper mechanics of the universe. The hunt intensified. And in 1460, one of Cosimo's agents, a monk named Leonardo da Pistoia, returned from Macedonia with a bundle of rotting parchment that would change the world forever. It was the Corpus Hermeticum. At the time, they believed these texts were written by Hermes Trismegistus, an ancient Egyptian sage who was a contemporary of Moses, perhaps even a teacher to the prophets. They believed this was the source code of all religion, the primordial truth before it was diluted by centuries of dogma. The arrival of this manuscript in Florence triggered a crisis in the Medici household. Cosimo was old now. He was dying. His body was failing, racked by gout and the exhaustion of ruling a republic from the shadows. He had commissioned a brilliant young scholar, the son of his physician, named Marsilio Ficino, to translate the complete works of Plato. It was a monumental task intended to be the legacy of the Medici. But when Cosimo heard that the Hermetica had arrived, he made a decision that reveals his true priorities. He ordered Ficino to stop. He told the young scholar to push Plato aside, to leave the great philosopher of reason gathering dust, and to translate the Egyptian magic first. "Translate it now," the old banker commanded, "before I die." Why? Why was a dying man so desperate to hear the words of an Egyptian sorcerer? Because the Corpus Hermeticum contained the secrets of alchemy and astrology. It promised that the universe was alive, a web of sympathies and invisible forces. Its central tenet, as above, so below, suggested that the movements of the stars mirrored the events on Earth, and more importantly, that a wise man, a magus, could pull down the power of the stars and trap it in physical objects. For a banker, this was the ultimate validation. As above, so below was the metaphysical equivalent of a balance sheet. It meant that material wealth was not separate from spiritual power. They were reflections of each other. If Cosimo could harness the stars, he could justify his gold. He could claim that his manipulation of the Florentine state was not tyranny, but a form of natural magic, bringing the city into alignment with the heavens. Ficino worked feverishly. He translated the Greek into Latin, reading the chapters aloud to the dying Cosimo. The richest man in Europe lay in a bed draped with velvet, his breathing shallow, listening with rapt attention as a young scholar read words that had been silent for 1,000 years. They read about how to breathe life into statues. They read about how to create talismans that could ward off disease or attract favor. They read about the astral body and the immortality of the soul, not through penance, but through knowledge. Gnosis. This was the birth of the Medici occult tradition. It wasn't a hobby. It was the foundation of their new identity. Cosimo established the Platonic Academy at his villa in Careggi, but it wasn't a university in the modern sense. It was a coven of intellectuals. They burned incense, they sang Orphic hymns to the sun, and they attempted to synchronize their souls with the planetary spheres. Under Cosimo's patronage, Florence became the European capital of the occult. It became a city where the line between science and sorcery vanished. The artists he sponsored began to hide these symbols in their work. Botticelli's Primavera isn't just a painting of spring. Scholars have argued for centuries that it is a complex talisman, a visual spell designed to invoke the benign influence of Venus and protect the city from the darker influence of Saturn. The art was the surface, the magic was the engine. But there was a darker implication to this new power. By embracing Hermeticism, Cosimo was stepping onto dangerous ground. He was essentially telling his circle that the church was incomplete. He was reviving the pagan gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, not as myths, but as psychological and cosmic forces that had to be appeased. He was teaching his family that power did not come from the consent of the governed, or even the divine right of kings. It came from knowledge. The man who knew the secrets of the universe had the right to rule it. This is the seed that would grow into the monstrous arrogance of his descendants. Cosimo died in 1464, shortly after the translation was finished. He died happy, believing he had glimpsed the secret architecture of God. He left behind a city filled with art, a bank filled with florins, and a library filled with forbidden books. But he also left a dangerous inheritance. He had opened a door that could not be closed. He had taught his children and grandchildren that the rules of ordinary morality did not apply to the initiated. He taught them that if you were smart enough, if you were spiritual enough, you could manipulate reality itself. His grandson Lorenzo would take this lesson to heart. But where Cosimo used magic to save his soul, Lorenzo would use it to bind a city. Lorenzo, known to history as the Magnificent, was a man of contradictions. He was a poet, a statesman, a lover, and a brute. And like his grandfather, he was obsessed with the hidden mechanics of fate. But Lorenzo's occultism was more tactile, more personal. He didn't just want to read about the stars, he wanted to live by them. The Florence of Lorenzo de' Medici was a city where the horoscope was as important as the exchange rate. No business deal was signed, no foundation stone laid, without consulting the astrologers. Lorenzo surrounded himself with the greatest minds of the era, Pico della Mirandola, Angelo Poliziano, and the aging Marsilio Ficino, and turned the Medici court into a continuous experiment in magical living. They practiced magia naturalis, natural magic. Rather than summoning demons, they sought to capture the spirit of the world, spiritus mundi. They believed that music, scent, wine, and beauty were all channels for this spirit. This offers a chillingly pragmatic explanation for the Medici's famous patronage of the arts. While history praises their patronage of Michelangelo and Botticelli for its beauty, the occult lens reveals a functional purpose. Through their eyes, a statue of Apollo became more than decoration. It functioned as a battery for solar energy. A perfectly proportioned building could resonate with the music of the spheres and bring harmony to the populace. Lorenzo was essentially engaging in massive-scale psychological warfare, using esoteric symbols. He was calming the volatile, violent mob of Florence by literally surrounding them with spells cast in marble and paint. He was drugging the city with beauty. But Lorenzo's personal application of these arts revealed the growing darkness in the family bloodline. He was a man who needed total control, and that extended to the people around him. This need for control bled into his love life, marking the first instance of the Medici weaponizing human emotion. Lorenzo was married to Clarice Orsini, a woman from a powerful Roman noble family. It was a cold political match arranged by his mother using intense astrological vetting to ensure the dynasties wouldn't clash. Clarice was pious, stiff, and utterly unsuited to the neo-pagan atmosphere of Florence. She didn't understand the poetry, the philosophy, or the magic. So Lorenzo created a shadow queen. Her name was Lucrezia Donati. Lucrezia was the most beautiful woman in Florence. She was married to another man, which in the strange logic of courtly love made her perfect. Lorenzo publicly declared her his muse. He wrote poems to her, threw tournaments in her honor, and held great public festivals celebrating her beauty. Historians often dismiss this as a standard Petrarchan romance, a chaste intellectual love fashionable at the time. But in the context of Lorenzo's hermetic obsession, it was something else. Ficino, the family's resident wizard, wrote extensively about the magic of love. He theorized that love was a form of infection, a spirit passing from the eyes of the beloved into the soul of the lover. He believed that by focusing intense emotional energy on a beautiful object or person, a magus could elevate his own consciousness. Lorenzo used Lucrezia Donati as a living talisman. By projecting this image of impossible idealized love, he created a cult of personality around himself. He wasn't just a banker, he was the hero of a living romance novel that the whole city was reading. He paraded Lucrezia through the streets like a pagan goddess, and by associating himself with her, he absorbed her charisma. It was a brilliant political maneuver. It distracted the people from his eroding bank accounts and his tightening grip on the government. Who cares about tax reform when the prince is singing sonnets to the moon? But there were whispers that it went deeper. The Medici circle was rumored to practice rituals designed to heighten these energies, feasts that blurred the line between symposium and bacchanal. They drank wine infused with gold dust and gems, believing it would harden their spirits against melancholy and misfortune. They sought to become solar beings, radiant and untouchable. Yet for all his magic, Lorenzo could not control everything. The banking empire was crumbling. The branches in London and Bruges were failing due to negligence. The gold was running out. and as the money faded, the magic became more desperate. Lorenzo began to rely more heavily on the darker aspects of astrology. He became paranoid about his own fate. The natural magic of light and song began to give way to a fascination with protection and vengeance. This shift set the stage for the true descent that was to come. Lorenzo's generation played with magic as a philosophical tool, a way to enhance life and cement power. They convinced themselves it was compatible with Christianity, that they were simply unlocking the secrets of God's creation. But they had planted a seed of hubris. They had established the belief that the Medici were special, that they possessed secret knowledge, which placed them above the laws of ordinary men. They had built a bridge between the counting house and the conjuring circle. Cosimo sought magic to save his soul. Lorenzo used it to enchant a city. But the next generation, the children who grew up watching these rituals, breathing in the incense of the Platonic Academy, would strip away the philosophical pretense. They would stop looking at the stars for wisdom and start looking at the darkness between them for weapons. As Lorenzo's reign neared its end, the bright solar magic of the early Renaissance was about to be eclipsed. The stage was set for a new kind of Medici, one who wouldn't just read about potions in ancient books, but would brew them. One who wouldn't just cast horoscopes, but would ensure they came true with the tip of a poisoned dagger. The era of the banker magus was ending. But before the darkness consumed the family at home, it would first consume the holiest city on earth. The ambition that started in a bank vault was about to ascend to the throne of St. Peter. The story centers on Giovanni de Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Groomed for power from the moment he drew breath, Giovanni was made a cardinal at the age of 13, a boy prince of the church who had never saved a soul in his life. In 1513, he ascended to the throne of St. Peter as Pope Leo X. He was 37 years old, obese, suffering from ulcers and fistulas, and utterly devoid of spiritual vocation. His first words to his brother upon his election are the most famous and damning in papal history. God has given us the papacy. Now let us enjoy it. And enjoy it he did. Under Leo X, the Vatican ceased to be a place of worship and became a theater of excess that rivaled the Roman emperors. He turned the papal apartments into a perpetual banquet hall. These were dinners where 65 courses were served, where little boys popped out of puddings to recite poetry, and where jesters and buffoons mocked the sacraments for the Pope's amusement. He kept a white elephant named Hanno, a gift from the King of Portugal, in the Vatican gardens. And when the animal died, the Pope wept more for the beast than he ever did for the poor of Rome. He spent money with a manic, compulsive intensity. He spent the entire treasury left by his predecessor. Then he spent the projected revenue of the next papacy. Then he borrowed from every bank in Europe. By 1517, the Vatican was bankrupt. The construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica, the monument meant to immortalize the Medici name in stone, ground to a halt. The Pope needed gold, rivers of it. And since he couldn't tax the kings of Europe any further, he decided to sell the only product he had an endless supply of: salvation. This is where the Medici genius for financial occultism comes into play. Leo X didn't invent the indulgence, a document granting remission of the temporal punishment for sin, but he industrialized it. He turned a spiritual concept into a tradable commodity. He authorized the sale of plenary indulgences, certificates that promised the buyer a straight shot to heaven, bypassing the fires of purgatory. But he went further. He introduced a new product line, indulgences for the dead. You could pay to save the soul of your grandmother, who was already burning. The marketing campaign was run by a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, but the mastermind was Leo. They used slogans that sound like modern jingles. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. To the superstitious peasantry of Europe, this was literal magic. The Pope, God's vicar on earth, was selling a talisman, a piece of paper with a seal, that had the power to alter the laws of the afterlife. It was the ultimate alchemy, turning the base metal of a peasant's life savings into the gold of spiritual purity. Leo X was essentially acting as a sorcerer king, claiming he had the power to unlock the gates of the divine for a fee. The money poured in. It funded the dome of St. Peter's. It paid for the Raphael frescoes. It bought the jewels for the Pope's mistresses and the wine for his feasts. But it also rotted the foundation of the church. In distant Germany, an obscure monk named Martin Luther watched this spiritual prostitution with horror. He saw the poor starving to buy Medici paper. In 1517, driven by a rage that would change the world, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. He wasn't just attacking a fundraising drive, he was attacking the Medici. He was calling out the Pope as the Antichrist, a man who had turned the temple of God into a den of thieves. Leo X, wrapped in his silk and smelling of perfume, dismissed Luther as a drunken German who would sober up. It was the greatest miscalculation in history. The Reformation exploded, tearing Europe in half, sparking wars that would last for a century and kill millions. The Medici Pope had wanted to build a beautiful church. Instead, he broke Christianity. He died in 1521, abruptly and suspiciously. Some say of malaria, others whisper of poison, clutching his jewels, leaving behind a Europe in flames and a church in schism. He had sold the soul of the world to pay for his pleasure, proving that the Medici touch could indeed turn everything to gold, but the gold was always cold, and it always demanded blood in return. If Leo X was the party, his cousin Pope Clement VII, Giulio de' Medici, was the hangover. Clement ascended the throne in 1523, inheriting the chaos Leo had unleashed. Clement was a true Medici, intelligent, secretive, and obsessed with micromanagement, but he lacked the charisma of his cousin. He was a man of hesitation, a vacillator, who consulted astrologers before making decisions, and then changed his mind when the stars shifted. He tried to play the great powers of Europe, France and the Holy Roman Empire, against each other, using the old Medici tactics of duplicity and shifting alliances. He thought he could outsmart Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man on earth. He thought he could weave a web of diplomacy that would keep Rome safe. He was wrong. The old magic, the ability to dazzle and deceive, had run out. The Emperor Charles V, tired of the Pope's treachery, allowed his army of mercenaries to march on Rome. These were not the chivalrous knights of old. These were the Landsknechte, starving, unpaid, ferocious German Lutherans who hated the Pope as the whore of Babylon. They marched south not just for conquest, but for vengeance. On May 6, 1527, the unthinkable happened. The walls of Rome, the eternal city, were breached. The sack of Rome began. It is difficult to convey the horror of what followed. It was the apocalypse. The Swiss Guard was slaughtered on the steps of St. Peter's, fighting to the last man to buy Clement time to escape. The Pope, hitching up his white robes, ran for his life along the Passetto di Borgo, a secret fortified corridor linking the Vatican to the Castel Sant'Angelo. He locked himself in the fortress, looking down from the ramparts as his city was turned into a slaughterhouse. For 8 days, the mercenaries rampaged. They didn't just kill, they desecrated. They turned St. Peter's Basilica into a stable for their horses. They drank wine from the sacred chalices. They dressed the statues of saints in prostitutes' clothing. They tortured cardinals to reveal where their gold was hidden. Nuns were brutalized on the altars. The smoke of burning palaces turned the Roman sky black. Inside the Castel Sant'Angelo, Clement VII sat in the dark, unshaven, weeping. The Medici power, which had seemed so invincible, so supported by money and magic, crumbled before the brute reality of steel. The godfathers of the Renaissance were reduced to a trembling man hiding in a tower while his legacy burned. It was the end of the high Renaissance. The optimism, the beauty, the belief that man could equal the gods, it all died in the sack of Rome. And it was the Medici who had led the world to this precipice. They had tried to buy God, and God had sent the devil to collect the debt. The sack of Rome broke Clement physically and spiritually. When he finally emerged, he was a ghost. He let his beard grow long and wild as a sign of mourning, never shaving again. He spent his remaining years plotting not for the glory of the church, but for the survival of his family. He realized that the only way to save the Medici name was to graft it onto the very powers that had crushed him. In a final act of desperate dynastic maneuvering, he arranged the marriage of his young niece, Catherine, to the son of the French king. He shipped the infection of Medici ambition to Paris, planting the seeds for the next chapter of darkness. Clement died in 1534, not from a sword, but from the rot within, eating a poisonous mushroom, or perhaps simply succumbing to a body destroyed by stress and grief. His corpse, like his cousins, was said to have been treated with disrespect, a final indignity for the man who lost Rome. Clement died in 1534, a broken man giving way to a broken era. Yet in Florence, the Medici name did not disappear. It merely festered. The Republic was dead, replaced by a dark parody of nobility under the rule of Alessandro de Medici. No longer bankers manipulating from the shadows. They were now dukes, absolute tyrants imposed by foreign armies. The man sitting on the throne was Alessandro de Medici, known as Il Moro, the Moor, due to his mixed heritage, rumored to be the illegitimate son of Pope Clement VII, and a servant of African descent. Alessandro was the living embodiment of everything the Medici had become: powerful, dissolute, and utterly corrupt. He ruled not with wisdom, but with a terrifying impulsiveness. He roamed the streets of Florence at night with his guards, breaking into homes, violating women, and insulting the old nobility. He turned the city into his personal harem. But the most dangerous thing about Alessandro was not his cruelty. It was his trust. He believed that his bloodline made him untouchable. He was wrong. The rot was already inside the house. The instrument of his destruction was his own cousin, Lorenzino de Medici. If Alessandro was the brute, Lorenzino was the snake. Thin, intellectual, and brooding, Lorenzino was a playwright and a scholar who despised the tyranny of his cousin, yet he played the role of the sycophant perfectly. He became Alessandro's shadow, his drinking buddy, and his pimp. Lorenzino earned the Duke's trust by procuring women for him, organizing his debaucheries, and laughing at his cruel jokes. The court called him Lorenzaccio, Bad Lawrence, mocking his servility. But beneath the mask of the court jester, Lorenzino was plotting a piece of theater that would end in real blood. He saw himself as a modern Brutus, destined to free Florence from its Caesar, and he knew exactly how to trap the Duke. He would not use an army. He would use the Medici family's favorite weapon, sex. On the night of January 6, 1537, the feast of the Epiphany, Lorenzino set the stage. He whispered to Alessandro that he had finally arranged a meeting with a woman the Duke had long coveted, a virtuous married noblewoman, often cited as Lorenzino's own aunt, Caterina Ginori, or his sister, adding a layer of incestuous horror to the trap. He told Alessandro that she would meet him in secret, in Lorenzino's own bedroom, but only if the Duke came alone and unarmed to protect her reputation. Alessandro, blinded by lust and arrogant confidence, agreed. He dismissed his bodyguards. He wore a coat lined with fur against the winter chill, but carried no weapon. He entered Lorenzino's chamber, unbuckled his sword, and lay down on the bed waiting for the prize he had been promised. He was tired, drunk on wine and anticipation, drifting into a doze. The tension in that room must have been suffocating. A duke, disrobed and vulnerable, waiting for a lover, while in the shadows, death was sharpening a knife. Lorenzino did not bring the woman. He returned with a hired assassin named Squadron, a brute paid in gold to do the wet work. They entered the room quietly. Lorenzino walked up to the bed where his cousin lay. Alessandro looked up, expecting a kiss. Instead, Lorenzino asked, "Are you sleeping, my lord?" and plunged a sword into him. What followed was not a clean political assassination. It was a butchery born of intimacy. Alessandro, strong and desperate, fought back. He was pinned to the bed, defenseless, struggling against two armed men. The room became a slaughterhouse. At one point, Alessandro bit Lorenzino's thumb so hard he wouldn't let go, even as he was being stabbed. They rolled on the floor, slipping in blood, knocking over furniture, gasping for breath. Finally, Scoronconcolo managed to cut the Duke's throat. The struggle ended. The tyrant of Florence lay dead, wrapped in the bloody sheets of his cousin's bed. Lorenzino looked down at the work of his hands. He had killed the monster, but he had also killed the main line of the Medici family. He locked the door, leaving the corpse to rot in the silence, and fled into the night, riding hard for Venice. He thought he would be hailed as a hero, a liberator. But Florence was too broken, too tired to rise. The assassination didn't bring back the Republic. It just brought another Medici. But the manner of Alessandro's death, lured by sex, killed by family, butchered in a bedroom, remains the perfect, grim epitaph for the dynasty. It was the ultimate expression of the Medici pathology, desire and death, inextricably linked. Alessandro's murder was the bloody finale of the Medici in Florence, a house consuming itself. But the true carrier of the family's dark genius was no longer in Italy. Years prior, the family had exported their most valuable asset to France, planting a seed of ambition that would soon choke the Valois court. Her name was Catherine. Before she brought darkness to France, the darkness forged her. She was not born a monster. She was crafted into one by a childhood so traumatic that it would have broken a lesser spirit. Long before she was the Black Queen of the Louvre, she was the Duchess of Sorrows, a pawn in a violent game played by ruthless men. Her education in the fragility of power began not in a library, but in a convent under siege. In 1527, when the Florentines revolted against the Medici rule, an 8-year-old Catherine was taken hostage. For 3 years, she lived with the constant, terrified knowledge that the mob outside the walls wanted to murder her. Debates raged in the city council on how best to dispose of the Medici brat. Some suggested hanging her from the city walls in a basket to be shot at by soldiers, while others, more vile, proposed handing her over to a military camp to destroy her family's honor forever. Scar tissue formed on the soul of the child as she listened to debates about the disposal of her own body. This was the crucible that burned away her innocence and replaced it with a cold, calcified resolve to survive at any cost. She learned early that God might not save you, and that the only thing the world respects is power. When her uncle, Pope Clement VII, finally reclaimed Florence and retrieved her, Catherine was no longer a person. She was a geopolitical asset. In 1533, at the age of 14, she was bartered like cattle to the French crown. Her marriage to Henry, the Duke of Orleans and second son of King Francis I, was a transaction, pure and simple. The Pope promised a staggering dowry of gold, strategic alliances, and Italian territories to the cash-strapped French monarchy. Catherine was shipped from Livorno to Marseille in a galley covered in gold leaf and purple silk, a floating spectacle of Medici wealth designed to mask the uncomfortable truth. She was a commoner marrying into the most arrogant bloodline in Europe. She was a merchant's daughter, a descendant of bankers and pharmacists, stepping into a court that viewed commerce as a sin and Italians as deceitful poisoners. When she stepped off that ship, dripping in pearls and brocade, she wasn't walking into a fairy tale. She was walking into a lion's den where she was the only unarmed civilian. The humiliation began immediately. The French court was a place of dazzling cruelty, and Catherine was the perfect target. She was short, having inherited the Medici features, large protruding eyes and a stark, heavy face, rather than the delicate beauty prized by the French. They mocked her accent, her clothes, and her appetite, but the true torture was her marriage. Her husband, Henry, was a sullen, athletic teenager who looked at his new bride with total indifference. On their wedding night, a ritual witnessed by the king and the pope to ensure consummation, nothing sparked between them but duty. Henry performed the act and then retreated, leaving Catherine alone in the dark. She soon realized that she was fighting a battle she had already lost. Henry's heart, body, and soul belonged entirely to another woman, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was everything Catherine was not. She was 20 years older than Henry, tall, statuesque, quintessentially French, and radiantly beautiful. She was the moon to Catherine's shadow. Diane didn't just share Henry's bed, she controlled his mind. She managed his education, his wardrobe, and his politics. Catherine was forced to watch day after agonizing day as her husband publicly fawned over this older woman, wearing Diane's colors, black and white, at tournaments, and deferring to her in court. Catherine was the Duchess, yet she was treated like an unwanted guest in her own marriage. She was isolated, friendless, and mocked as the Italian shopkeeper. She learned to smile while swallowing bile, developing a mask of impassive patience that would become her trademark. But beneath that mask, desperation was festering. The situation spiraled from painful to life-threatening when the years began to pass without a pregnancy. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, a decade of barrenness. In the 16th century, a royal wife had one singular purpose: to produce male heirs. A queen who could not breed was a broken machine, a political liability. By 1543, the whispers in the Louvre had turned into a roar. The court poets wrote stinging verses about her sterility. The king's advisors openly urged Henry to repudiate her, to annul the marriage and send her back to Italy in disgrace so he could marry a fertile princess. For Catherine, this was a death sentence. To be cast out meant losing her protection, her status, and likely her life, as she would be a defenseless pawn on the European chessboard. She saw the precipice approaching. She prayed to the Catholic God. She went on pilgrimages. She consulted the best physicians in Paris who prescribed humiliating regimens, but her womb remained closed. When the church and science failed her, Catherine de Medici did what her ancestors had always done. She turned to the shadows. If the light of God would not shine on her, she would light a candle in the dark. Catherine began to secretly consult the network of Italian occultists she had quietly embedded in her household. She ceased to be merely a victim of biology and decided to become a manipulator of reality. This was the moment the Black Queen was truly born. She retreated into the hidden chambers of her apartments, rooms heavy with the scent of heavy incense and dried herbs, to consult the miroir Arden, her dark scrying mirror. This was not a vanity object. It was a tool of high magic, a polished surface of obsidian or a metallic alloy of the 7 planetary metals, designed to bridge the gap between the material world and the spirit realm. Historians and occult scholars believe Catherine used this mirror not just for foresight, but for psychological grounding. In the swirling depths of the black glass, she sought reassurance that her destiny was not to be a discarded wife. She believed she saw a future where she was surrounded by crowned children. This belief, however delusional it might have seemed to an outsider, gave her a terrifying, ironclad confidence. It allowed her to walk into a room full of enemies who wanted her gone and smile at them, because she believed she had seen their graves. But visions were not enough. She needed physical intervention. The treatments Catherine subjected herself to during this period reveal the horrific intersection of Renaissance medicine and folk magic. She turned to alchemy and sympathy magic to force her body into submission. Under the guidance of her secretive physicians and soothsayers, likely including the early mentors of the infamous Ruggieri, she engaged in rituals that would make a modern stomach turn. It is recorded that she drank the urine of pregnant mules, believing the sympathetic properties of the animal's fertility would transfer to her. She consumed mixtures of cow dung and ground stag antlers. But the occultism went deeper. She began wearing a girdle of Venus, a talismanic belt treated with specific chemical fluids and inscribed with sigils and names of power, worn directly against her skin to draw down planetary influences into her womb. She had holes bored into the floor of the room above her husband's bedchamber, not for voyeurism, but to observe the mechanics of his intercourse with Diane de Poitiers, trying to understand what she was doing wrong, blending observation with a bizarre form of sex magic. She studied the positions, the timing, the atmosphere, treating sex as a spell that needed to be cast correctly. There are persistent, darker rumors that she participated in rituals invoking the spirits of the dead, seeking to trade life for life, promising the darkness that if she were granted a son, she would serve the interests of power above all else. Whether she literally signed a pact with a demon is a matter of theology, but metaphorically she absolutely did. She sacrificed her moral compass on the altar of survival. She decided that there was no line she would not cross, no substance she would not drink, and no power she would not invoke to keep her crown. And then the impossible happened. The magic, or perhaps the relentless persistence, worked. In 1544, after 10 long dry years, Catherine de Medici gave birth to a son, Francis. The court was stunned. The barren Italian had produced a dauphin, but Catherine did not stop there. It was as if a dam had broken or a debt had been paid. She went on to give birth to 10 children in roughly 12 years. The sickly, ignored wife became a biological powerhouse, the mother of the Valois. The talk of divorce evaporated instantly. She had secured her position with the only currency that mattered, blood. However, those who looked closely at the Medici children noticed something unsettling. They were frail. Many suffered from physical deformities or chronic illnesses. They were mentally unstable, prone to violent rages or deep melancholia. The court whispered that the magic Catherine had used to conceive them had tainted their blood, that these children were born of potions and spells rather than natural grace. They were children of the mirror, born to a mother who had stared too long into the abyss. Catherine had won her war against nature, but the victory was hollow and ominous. She had saved herself from exile, but she had birthed a dynasty that seemed cursed from the cradle, a brood of doomed kings who would preside over the bloodiest chapter in French history. The orphan girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew that the devil keeps his promises, provided you are willing to pay his price. With the birth of her children, Catherine de Medici had secured her physical place in the French court, but she had not yet secured her power. She was still the foreigner, the merchant's daughter, the unwanted wife of a king who worshipped another woman. She realized that in a world governed by brute masculine force, swords, cannons, and cavalry, she could never compete on the battlefield. To survive the wolves circling the Louvre, she needed weapons that were silent, invisible, and struck from within. She needed to turn the very air her enemies breathed and the future they hoped for into instruments of terror. The nursery was full. Now it was time to fill the laboratory. The era of the Italian art, the euphemism for poisoning, was about to descend upon France like a toxic fog, and Catherine began to assemble a shadow cabinet of specialists whose job was not to govern the state, but to manipulate the laws of life and death. The most notorious of these dark architects was a man whose name became a curse whispered in the back alleys of Paris, Cosimo Ruggeri. If the Medici of Florence had employed philosophers to uplift the human soul, Catherine employed Ruggeri to drag it down into the mud. He was a Florentine astrologer, but to call him merely a stargazer is to misunderstand his utility. Ruggeri was a master of the left-hand path, a chemical engineer of malice. Catherine installed him in the Château de Chaumont and later in a tower at Blois, granting him a laboratory that became the dark heart of her operations. Historical accounts and court rumors paint a scene of Gothic nightmare, a workspace choked with the acrid fumes of sulfur, mercury, and arsenic, shelves lined with jars containing the desiccated organs of animals, and furnaces that burned day and night, not to smelt gold, but to refine the inheritance powders, toxins designed to mimic natural deaths. Ruggeri represented the weaponization of the Renaissance intellect. He brought the rigorous scientific method of Italy and applied it to murder. Under his tutelage, Catherine is said to have mastered the toxicology of the era. They weren't just interested in cyanide that killed instantly. That was too obvious, too clumsy. They sought the perfumed death, poisons that could be absorbed through the skin via a pair of scented gloves or a toxin brushed onto the pages of a book that would kill a man slowly as he licked his fingers to turn the pages. This was the terror of the Medici reputation. The idea that death could be anywhere. It could be in your wine, in the embroidered collar of your shirt, or in the wax of the candle burning by your bed. Ruggeri cast natal charts for Catherine's enemies, but these weren't for guidance. They were for tactical strikes. He calculated the critical days of a rival's life, periods when their planetary defenses were weak, and advised Catherine to strike then, blending metaphysical vulnerability with physical poison. The psychological impact on the French court was devastating. Stout warriors who feared no sword began to tremble at the sight of a letter from the Queen, terrified of what invisible agent might be laced within the paper. But while Ruggeri provided the mechanics of death, Catherine needed something more profound to control the minds of her subjects. She needed to commandeer fate itself. She needed a prophet. She found her instrument in a brilliant, terrifying physician from Provence named Michel de Nostradame, known to history as Nostradamus. When Catherine summoned him to Paris in 1555, he was already famous for his almanacs and centuries, cryptic verses that seemed to predict the future. But Catherine didn't want a carnival fortune teller. She wanted a divine seal of approval. She installed Nostradamus as counselor and physician in ordinary to her son, legitimizing him as a voice of the state. The relationship between the queen and the prophet was one of intense codependent obsession. Catherine was a woman driven by a desperate need for control, and Nostradamus provided her with the illusion of a script. They would spend hours in her private observatory at the top of the Colonne Medicis, a hollow column she had built specifically for stargazing. There, above the sleeping city of Paris, amidst the cold wind and the scratching of quills, Nostradamus fed her paranoia and her ambition. He cast the horoscopes of her sons, predicting that all of them would wear crowns. To a mother, this sounded like a blessing, a glorious dynasty stretching into the centuries. But Nostradamus's visions were double-edged swords. The prophecy that her sons would be kings carried the silent, horrific implication that for the younger ones to ascend, the older ones must die. He was predicting a conveyor belt of funerals, a dynasty consuming itself to stay in power. Catherine, blinded by the promise of crowns, chose to ignore the shadow of the coffins. She used his vague, terrifying quatrains as propaganda, circulating rumors that the stars were on her side, that resisting the Medici was resisting the will of the heavens. The climax of this occult dependence, the moment where the magic stopped being a game and became a horrific reality, arrived in the summer of 1559. It is one of the few instances in history where a specific documented prophecy appears to have played out with terrifying literalism. Nostradamus had penned a quatrain, Century 1, Quatrain 35, which read, "The young lion will overcome the older one, / on the field of combat in a single battle, / he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, / 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death." Catherine was haunted by these lines. She identified the older lion as her husband, King Henry II, who used the lion as his personal emblem. She begged him to avoid combat, to stop jousting, to heed the warnings of the stars. But Henry was a warrior king, vain and confident. He dismissed his wife's Italian superstitions as the hysterical fears of a grocer's daughter. On June 30th, 1559, during a grand tournament on the Rue Saint-Antoine to celebrate a peace treaty with Spain and the marriage of his daughter, Henry insisted on riding in the joust. He donned his shining armor and his helmet with a golden visor, the golden cage. He challenged the young Count of Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard, the young lion. Catherine watched from the stands, her heart hammering against her ribs, a black figure of dread amidst the colorful silks of the court. As the 2 men charged, thundering down the list, the air cracked with the sound of impact. Montgomery's lance struck the king's helmet and shattered. But instead of falling away, a long, jagged splinter of the wooden shaft flew upward. It pierced the king's golden visor, drove through his eye, and penetrated his brain. The prophecy materialized in blood before the horrified eyes of thousands. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. The king did not die instantly. The cruel death predicted by Nostradamus ensued. For 10 agonizing days, Henry II lay in his bedchamber, drifting between delirium and agony. The greatest surgeons of the age, including the anatomist Vesalius, were summoned. In a desperate, macabre attempt to understand the injury, they took the severed heads of 4 criminals executed that morning and thrust wooden splinters into their eyes at different angles, dissecting them right there in the antechamber to see how to extract the wood from the king's brain. Catherine sat by his bedside, stone-faced, watching the older lion rot alive, exactly as the quatrain had foretold. The 2 wounds were the eye and the throat, inextricably linked by infection. When Henry finally exhaled his last breath, the Catherine de Medici, who had arrived in France as a timid girl, died with him. In her place rose the Serpent Queen. The accuracy of the prophecy shattered whatever skepticism remained in her soul. She realized that the universe was not random. It was written, and it was cruel. If the stars could kill a king in full armor, then no one was safe. She adopted a broken lance as her new emblem with the motto, Lacrimae hinc hinc dolor. From this come my tears and my pain. She dressed in severe black mourning weeds, a costume she would never take off, turning herself into a living specter of grief and authority. The death of Henry II was the crucible that hardened the Medici occultism from a defensive shield into an offensive weapon. Catherine now believed completely in the power of Ruggieri and Nostradamus. She saw that knowledge of the future and the ability to manipulate the present through poison and fear were the only things that could keep her family alive. She looked at her sickly son, now King Francis II, and the vultures circling the throne, and she decided that she would no longer be the victim of fate. She would be its executioner. The laboratory fires were stoked higher. The spies were dispatched. The age of the flying squadron, her army of seductresses, was about to begin. The queen was dead. Long live the witch. By 1560, France was no longer a kingdom. It was a bleeding wound. The death of Henry II had shattered the central authority of the crown, leaving Catherine de Medici as the regent for her sickly adolescent son, Charles IX. She stood alone at the center of a viper's nest. To her right were the Guise faction, ultra-Catholic zealots who controlled the armies and viewed the Italian Queen Mother with sneering contempt. To her left were the Bourbons and the Huguenots, Protestants who were plotting rebellion and religious revolution. Both sides were led by hardened men, warlords who settled disputes with cavalry charges and massacres. Catherine had no army of her own. She had no personal loyalty from the generals. She was a foreign woman in a country that despised her, trying to hold together a crumbling dynasty with nothing but her wits. She realized that if she tried to fight these men with steel, she would lose. She needed a weapon that could bypass their armor, slip past their guards, and strike directly at their wills. She needed to exploit the one weakness that every great man in the Renaissance possessed, their insatiable, arrogant lust. And so, amidst the chaos of a looming civil war, Catherine de Medici began to assemble the most unique and devastating military unit in European history. It was not a regiment of musketeers, but a retinue of roughly 80 noblewomen, known to the court euphemistically as le Squadron volant, the flying squadron. History has often dismissed them as a royal harem or a collection of high-class courtesans, but this is a sexist simplification that misses the dark genius of Catherine's design. The flying squadron was an intelligence agency. It was a state-sponsored network of sleeper agents and saboteurs, weaponized to turn the bedroom into a battlefield. Catherine understood that a man who is thinking with his desire is a man who has stopped thinking with his brain. Her goal was to place one of her women in the bed of every major player in France, creating a surveillance state powered by pillow talk. The recruitment process for the squadron was as rigorous as the selection for any elite guard. Catherine did not scour the brothels of Paris. She scoured the aristocracy. She looked for the daughters of impoverished nobility, girls with impeccable bloodlines but no dowries, young women who were hungry for status and desperate for protection. She sought a specific psychological profile. They had to be beautiful, yes, radiant enough to turn the head of a prince, but they also had to be intelligent, malleable, and fundamentally amoral. They had to be willing to use their bodies as currency in service of the crown. Catherine offered them a devil's bargain. She would give them wealth, jewels, and the most glittering life in Europe. In exchange, they would give her their total obedience. They belonged to her. Once selected, these women entered what was effectively an academy of seduction within the royal household. Catherine, the stern and sexless widow in black, became the madam of this glittering school. The training went far beyond the physical act of sex. In the Renaissance court, a mistress was not merely a sex object. She was a companion, a confidant, and a cultural trophy. The agents of the squadron were drilled in the arts of conversation, music, and dance. They were taught to speak Latin and Italian, to discuss theology with bishops, and military strategy with generals. They learned how to be the perfect mirror, reflecting back exactly what the target wanted to see. If the target was a melancholy poet, the agent became a sympathetic muse. If he was a brash warrior, she became a damsel in distress who fed his ego. Catherine taught them the discipline of the long con, how to make a man fall in love, how to isolate him from his advisors, and how to extract state secrets in the vulnerable, hazy moments after intimacy. But this was a Medici operation, which meant the natural arts were always supplemented by the unnatural. The training of the flying squadron intersected darkly with the laboratories of Cosimo Ruggeri. Crucially, Catherine believed in the chemical manipulation of the soul. She did not leave the success of her agents to chance or natural charisma. The historical archives whisper of a chemical arsenal supplied to the squadron, perfumes laced with civet and musk, scents believed to bypass the rational mind and trigger primal aggression and desire, powders of Spanish fly and other toxic aphrodisiacs to be slipped into a target's wine to lower his inhibitions, and herbal tinctures designed to prevent pregnancy, or more cruelly, to induce it if an heir was needed to trap a man. Ruggeri provided the love magic, treating seduction as a biological hack. The women were reportedly given amulets and sigils to wear, binding spells to recite, blending the psychological manipulation of a spy with the ritualistic confidence of a witch. The strategic deployment of the squadron was a masterclass in divide and conquer. Catherine viewed the court not as a social gathering, but as a chessboard. When the powerful Prince of Condé, a leader of the Protestant rebels, threatened the throne, Catherine did not send an assassin. She sent Isabelle de Limeuil, a blonde beauty of undeniable charm. Her mission was to neutralize him, to keep him distracted and pliable, while Catherine reorganized her forces. When the relationship between the Catholic Guise faction and the Protestant Montmorency faction threatened to unite against the crown, Catherine deployed her agents to sleep with the leaders of both sides, planting rumors and jealousies, whispering lies between the sheets that would turn allies into enemies by breakfast. The atmosphere of the French court transformed under this influence. The royal balls and banquets became high-stakes hunting grounds. Beneath the veneer of chivalry and courtly love, a cold war was being fought. The maids of honor would drift through the halls like beautiful sharks, their fans fluttering, their eyes scanning the room for their assigned targets. A smile across a crowded room wasn't a flirtation, it was a tactical maneuver. A tryst in the garden wasn't romance, it was an interrogation. Catherine sat at the center of this web, often writing letters late into the night, digesting the intelligence her girls brought her. She knew who was broke, who was betraying whom, and who was vulnerable to blackmail. She ruled France not from the throne, but from the confidences stolen in the dark. However, the cost of this system was the utter dehumanization of the women involved. To Catherine, the members of the flying squadron were not human beings with hearts and souls. They were flesh and blood mechanisms. She demanded absolute emotional detachment. They were ordered to simulate passion without feeling it, to make men love them without falling in love themselves. It was a psychological meat grinder. These young women were forced to sleep with repulsive, aging, or violent men at the queen's command. If they succeeded, they were rewarded with pearls and titles. If they failed, if they got pregnant at the wrong time, or if they developed genuine feelings that compromised the mission, Catherine was ruthless. She would discard them instantly, casting them out of the court into poverty and disgrace, treating them like a jammed pistol that needed to be thrown away. The tragedy of the Flying Squadron is that these women, often remembered as villainous seductresses, were actually the first victims of Catherine's tyranny. They were soldiers who fought with their bodies, commanded by a general who felt no pain when they were wounded. If the Flying Squadron was an army, then Charlotte de Sauve was its most devastating siege weapon. Among this army of silk and secrets, one woman stood out as a geopolitical instrument capable of paralyzing nations. By the 1570s, France was teetering on the edge of the abyss. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had turned the streets of Paris red with Protestant blood, but the Huguenot resistance had not been broken. The crown was weak, held by Catherine's unstable sons, and the wolves were circling. Two men in particular posed an existential threat to the Medici grip on power. Henry of Navarre, the charismatic leader of the Protestant faction, and the future King Henry IV, and Francois, Duke of Alençon, Catherine's own youngest son, a treacherous and ambitious prince who was plotting to overthrow his brother. If these two men, the Protestant warlord and the rebel prince, were to join forces, they would have the military strength to crush Catherine and end the Valois dynasty. Catherine could not fight them on the battlefield, so she deployed Charlotte. Charlotte de Sauve was a physical anomaly in the French court, a woman of such breathtaking beauty that contemporary chroniclers struggle to find enough superlatives to describe her. While the fashion of the time often favored a severe, stylized look, Charlotte possessed a soft, ethereal radiance. Blonde curls, piercing eyes, and a terrifyingly sharp wit, wrapped in a demeanor of innocent vulnerability. She was the wife of a minor Secretary of State, a man who was conveniently ignored and pushed into the shadows, a cuckold by royal decree. Catherine de Medici selected Charlotte for the most delicate and dangerous mission of the era. She was to become the jailer of Henry of Navarre. Following the massacres of 1572, Henry was technically a free man at court, but in reality, he was a hostage, kept under constant surveillance in the Louvre. Catherine knew that stone walls could not hold a man like Henry. He would eventually escape to lead his armies unless he was given a reason to stay. That reason was Charlotte. The operation began with a calculated precision that belies the romantic myths of the era. Catherine orchestrated the initial meetings, ensuring that Charlotte was placed in Henry's path at every turn, at Mass, at dances, in the hunting parties in the forests of Fontainebleau. The Queen Mother watched from the shadows as the trap snapped shut. Henry of Navarre, known for his insatiable appetite for women, fell violently, obsessively in love. This was not a casual affair. It was a psychological enslavement. Charlotte, trained in the dark arts of the squadron, knew exactly how to manipulate him. She fed his ego. She soothed his fears about his precarious position as a hostage, and she offered him a sanctuary of pleasure in a castle filled with assassins. For months, the great Protestant hope, the man whom thousands of soldiers were waiting to follow into battle, spent his days picking out ribbons for Charlotte's hair and his nights in her bed. He stopped plotting his escape. He stopped writing to his generals. He was neutralized without a drop of blood being spilled. Catherine de Medici had effectively placed the leader of the opposition in a coma of lust. But Catherine's genius and her cruelty lay in her ability to multitask. She realized that keeping Henry docile was not enough. She needed to ensure he remained isolated. She needed to break the potential alliance between Henry and her rebellious son, Alençon. So she issued a new order to Charlotte: seduce Alençon too. It takes a moment to fully grasp the depravity of this command. A mother ordered her employee to sleep with her own son, solely to use that intimacy to destroy his political relationship with his best friend. Charlotte obeyed. She moved between the two men with the grace of a phantom. She seduced the Duke of Alençon, playing on his inferiority complex, telling him that he was the true power in France, feeding his jealousy of Henry. What followed was a masterclass in the triangle of hate. Charlotte de Sauve became the pivot point upon which the fate of France turned. She would spend the night with Henry, and then whisper to Alençon the next morning that Henry had mocked him, calling him weak and ugly. Then she would go to Henry and tell him that Alençon was planning to betray him to the Queen. She whipped the two men into a frenzy of sexual jealousy and paranoia. The historical records describe a court descending into farce and tragedy simultaneously. Two of the most powerful men in Europe, who should have been planning a revolution, were instead getting into screaming matches in the corridors of the Louvre over who Charlotte loved more. They were reduced to lovesick teenagers, paralyzed by their obsession with a woman who reported every word they said to Catherine de Medici before breakfast. The War of the Lovers reached such a fever pitch that it effectively froze the political clock of France. For nearly 2 years, the anti-royalist alliance was stalled because its leaders could not stop fighting over a mistress. Catherine sat back and watched the chaos with satisfaction. The flying squadron had proven that a well-placed wound was worth 10,000 arquebusiers, but the toll on Charlotte was immense. She was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. She was sleeping with two men who hated each other, reporting to a queen who terrified her, and living a life of total deceit. There are glimpses in the letters of the time that suggest Charlotte was not just a cold robot. She may have actually fallen in love with Henry of Navarre, adding a layer of genuine tragedy to her duplicity. Yet, she could never show it. To show loyalty to the target was treason to the queen. She was a woman trapped in a role, acting out a script of passion while her soul was ground down by the friction of statecraft. Eventually, the spell broke, as all spells must. Henry of Navarre finally realized that he was being played. The fog of lust lifted enough for him to see the bars of his cage. In 1576, he managed to escape the court during a hunt, fleeing south to rally his armies. He would go on to become one of France's greatest kings, but he never forgot Charlotte. Years later, even after all the betrayal, he would speak of her with a strange mixture of bitterness and longing, a testament to the absolute thoroughness of her seduction. But for Catherine, the mission was a success. Charlotte had bought the monarchy time. She had delayed the civil war for years, allowing Catherine to maneuver and survive. The Venus trap had worked perfectly. However, not every agent of the squadron was as skilled or as lucky as Charlotte de Sauve. While Charlotte managed to walk the razor's edge and survive, others fell. However, Charlotte was the exception, a diamond that refused to crack. Others were not so fortunate. The tragic unraveling of Isabelle de Lamuille reveals the brutal reality awaiting any tool that dared to develop a human heart. She was the glass that shattered. Her story is crucial because it rips away the romantic veil of courtly intrigue to reveal the brutal industrial reality of Catherine de Medici's spy ring. Isabel was a high-born noblewoman, a distant relation to the Medici themselves, and possessed of a beauty described as soft and languid, a stark contrast to the sharp intelligence of her peers. Catherine selected her for a target of immense importance, Louis de Bourbon, the Prince of Condé. Condé was the military fist of the Protestant rebellion, a hardened soldier who spent his life in the saddle. Catherine needed him neutralized. She needed him out of the war tent and into the bedchamber. She deployed Isabel with the standard orders: seduce, placate, spy. At first, the mission proceeded with the mechanical efficiency Catherine demanded. During the long, grueling royal progress, a journey where the court traveled across France to display the king to his subjects, Isabel succeeded in capturing the prince. Condé, weary of war, fell into the soft trap laid for him. He became infatuated, spending hours in Isabel's carriage, neglecting his officers to compose love letters. The intelligence flowed back to Catherine. The rebellion stalled. The machine was working. But then the machine developed a biological glitch. Isabel de Limoux, young and perhaps naive, made the catastrophic error of falling in love with her target. And in her passion, she forgot the most important lesson of the Medici Academy: control. She became pregnant. In any other context, a pregnancy might be managed. But Isabel was unmarried, part of the Queen Mother's household, and carrying the child of the crown's greatest enemy during a delicate peace negotiation. It was a diplomatic nuclear bomb. For months, Isabel attempted to hide her condition. Imagine the physical and psychological torture of this young woman, forced to wear the rigid, bone-crushing corsets of the 16th century, cinched tight enough to bruise her ribs, trying to flatten a growing belly while dancing at balls and smiling at courtiers. She lived in a state of abject terror, knowing that discovery meant social death. She relied on the remedies provided by the darker corners of Catherine's court: herbal abortifacients, desperate prayers, perhaps even the intervention of Ruggieri, but the life inside her refused to be extinguished. The catastrophe struck in Lyon in 1564. The court was in residence, the atmosphere tense and crowded. During a grand public function, the physical strain became too much. Isabel collapsed. She went into labor right there in the palace, amidst the gasp of the crowd and the horrified stares of the nobility. There was no hiding it anymore. The maid of honor was giving birth to a bastard of the rebellion. The scandal was absolute. It confirmed everything the Protestant preachers had been screaming from their pulpits, that Catherine's court was a whorehouse of Satan, a place of debauchery and sin. Catherine's reaction to this event chills the blood and reveals the true nature of her leadership. A motherly figure might have shown pity. A political leader might have shown anger. Catherine showed only cold bureaucratic disposal. She did not view Isabel as a relative in distress. She viewed her as a broken tool. A spy who gets caught is useless. A weapon that backfires is discarded. Catherine publicly disowned Isabel instantly. She wrote venomous letters stripping Isabel of her rank and position. She did not execute her. That would have made her a martyr. But she did something worse. She banished Isabel to a convent in Auxonne, effectively burying her alive. The child, a son, died shortly after birth, a victim of the stress and the corset. Isabel de Limoux, once the toast of Paris, spent the rest of her days in obscurity, poverty, and disgrace, a living ghost haunting the fringes of history. Her destruction served as a terrifying memo to the other members of the flying squadron. Serve the queen, and you will wear diamonds. Fail the queen, and you will cease to exist. Yet for all her ruthlessness, Catherine could not calculate the one variable that defies all magic, the decay of the blood itself. While she perfected the arts of survival, the dynasty she fought to protect was rotting from within. The curse of the Valois unfolded with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Her son, Charles IX, the king responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, decayed from the inside out. Haunted by the screams of the Protestants he had ordered killed, he descended into madness and physical decay. He sweated blood a rare medical condition perhaps, or a poetic manifestation of his guilt. He died at 23, raving and terrified, clinging to his mother's hand. Next came Henry III, Catherine's favorite. He was intelligent but erratic, obsessed with religious cults and bizarre court rituals. He was a king who dressed in women's clothes one day and penitent sackcloth the next. Catherine tried to hold his kingdom together, but the hate she had cultivated for decades was too strong. In 1589, months after Catherine herself died, despairing and exhausted, witnessing the ruin of everything she built, Henry III was assassinated by a fanatic monk. With his death, the Valois line was extinguished. The prophecy of Nostradamus had completed its circle. The Medici blood had sat on the throne of France, and it had left nothing behind but graves and a country in ashes. Back in Florence, the Medici dynasty trundled on for 2 more centuries, but the fire was gone. The Magus bankers were replaced by a line of bloated, pompous Grand Dukes who cared more for etiquette than innovation. The biological bill for generations of inbreeding and debauchery began to come due. The family was plagued by gout, arthritis, and strange genetic maladies. They became caricatures of nobility, stiff and lifeless in their portraits. The end of the Medici story, the true final whimper, came in 1737 with the death of Gian Gastone de Medici. He was the last Grand Duke, and he was a grotesque parody of his ancestors. He spent the last years of his life almost entirely in bed, too obese and lethargic to move. He was surrounded not by philosophers or artists, but by a troupe of young, dissolute sycophants known as the Ruspanti, whom he paid to entertain him with vulgarities. The man who sat on the throne of Lorenzo the Magnificent was a recluse who despised fresh air, despised women, and despised ruling. When he died, childless and miserable, the Medici line simply ceased. There was no bang, no explosion, no grand magical ritual. Just a fat, sad man dying in a room that smelled of stale perfume and decay. Walk through Florence today, and you see the dome of Brunelleschi rising like a golden mountain. You see the Uffizi Gallery and the statues of David and Perseus. Guidebooks will tell you that the Medici bought this beauty, that they were the patrons of the light. But now you know the price of that light. You know that the gold that paid for the paint was washed in the blood of the Pazzi conspiracy and the sweat of the indulgence trade. You know that the statues of ideal beauty were admired by men who hunted women like game and used their bodies as political currency. You know that behind the philosophy of the Platonic Academy, there was a dark library of spells and poisons, a desperate attempt to hack the code of God. The Medici were the first modern dynasty to understand the terrible truth of power, that it does not respect morality. They showed us that art and horror can coexist in the same heart. They proved that you can build a paradise on earth, but you might have to make a deal with hell to finance it. They were the bankers of the soul, the merchants of fate, and the architects of our modern world. They taught us that the line between a statesman and a sorcerer is thinner than a knife's edge. And in the end, they remind us that no matter how much gold you have, no matter how many armies you command, and no matter how many spells you cast, you cannot bribe death. The balls on their coat of arms were meant to represent coins or pills, or perhaps the apples of the Hesperides. But in the twilight of their history, they look more like drops of blood.